a biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
On a Wednesday, we love to check in with Mandy Worby, who I might say, just as we get the conversation underway, not everybody's happy with everything you say, Mandy.
No, that's okay. They don't have to be. all I would actually say is just go and do a little research and check it out. I'm not pulling this stuff out of thin air. There's some really good resources out there that are beyond what you're just going to hear in the mainstream.
Exactly. The mainstream media is so influential and prevalent in the minds even of Christian believers. Sometimes it's very confronting to hear an alternative.
And let's just be honest, they're fed a narrative and they feed that narrative out, okay?
Yep, okay. Let's start with Hamas and a history of breaking ceasefires. We've all been excited about peace coming to the Middle East. What are your gleanings here from a little bit of history?
Listen, on day one of this recent ceasefire that was brokered by the US, Hamas broke it. They broke it on day one by not releasing all the hostages dead and alive. That was the agreement. All 20 living hostages were released, and then on the same day, 4 dead hostages were released. One of them was not an Israeli hostage. It was just a random man dressed in an IDF uniform, okay, which was a pretty cruel thing to do. Remember, they did the same thing with Shiri Bibas when she and her 2 babies were released. She wasn't. And then over the course of several other days, a few more dead hostages were released. But then all of a sudden Hamas stopped and they said, no, we can't find any more. Well, they have been able to find more because Israel said, well, then we're not going to abide by the agreement either. And they suddenly thought, okay, we need to. But as of this morning, there are still 13 hostages, dead hostages in Gaza. But there was an article called 6 Reasons Why an Unconditional Israel-Hamas Ceasefire is Not the Right Path Forward. This was online and they've made very good points. Okay, the 6 are: 1, Hamas has a long history of breaking ceasefire agreements. All of them, Neil, all of them. Yep. Number 2, Hamas remains committed to the death and destruction of Israel. They have not changed their charter and they continue to say that that's what they live for. Number 3, Hamas will use the ceasefire to regroup and rearm because that's what they have always done. Number 4, ceasefire may delay the possibility of returning the hostages home. As I said, there are still 13 in Gaza and they are leverage. That's what Hamas uses as leverage. Number 5, a ceasefire would embolden Hezbollah and Iran, and both of those organisations, groups, terror regimes have said exactly that. They are re-strengthening because they want to exterminate Israel. Number 6, removing Hamas would actually lead to a better future for Gaza and the Palestinian people, and it would. But Hamas doesn't want that because they use the suffering of their own people that they cause and blame Israel, and that's their excuse to continue the terrorism. So these are really important points, and they reveal that this repetitive history that we have with Hamas that we've had since they began in 1988. This is the reality that Israel lives with. And it's really easy, Neil, for the nations of the world to tell Israel what they should do in this situation when the nations of the world don't live with this existential threat on their back doorstep.
You mentioned the dead hostages, and 13 of those still held in Gaza. We might hope that Hamas can find those bodies, but you've even taken a little issue with how they're referring to these dead hostages. Yeah,
I was asked yesterday, actually, by a great supporter of Israel, actually, and he does work for Vision, and he just said, why do you refer to the dead hostages as hostages? He said, because they're actually murder victims of terror. Is it because maybe that term is a little graphic? You just don't want to say something too graphic? And I said, well, no, actually. And I thought, well, if he thinks that, maybe there are other people who wonder as well. And it would probably be important to sort of just let you know about, in Jewish custom and culture in Judaism, the importance and significance of the human body. Okay, in Genesis 1:26, that's where God said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. So your human body is sacred because it's created in the image and likeness of God. So every time there is a terror attack, there's an accident, a natural disaster, in Israel, Jewish people ensure that every element of the deceased people involved, even if it's the terrorist who's blown himself up, is collected. Okay, even blood spilled on the ground, it is all collected. It's treated with reverence and respect for proper burial because it is reflecting the image of God. Now, as well, in Judaism, there is the belief of a resurrection. Now, we're Christians, so we understand a resurrection, right? As such, the body is essential for that event, okay, in Jewish culture and belief and understanding. It's one of the reasons, Neil, why the Holocaust is still so traumatic for the Jewish people, because millions, multiplied millions of them were incinerated. In their mind, there's nothing left to resurrect. Yeah. Okay, so this is very, very difficult and traumatic for them. So regarding Israel's hostages in Gaza, yes, they were brutally murdered. There is no question, we're not hiding that fact. But to the Jewish mind, those bodies are being held hostage. They have to come home where they will be treated with respect and reverence and buried in the hope of the future resurrection. It's very important to them.
And I guess we can appreciate that there's a division within Christianity where some Christians, they want to be buried, they don't want to be cremated because, you know, there's this idea
Absolutely.
of the body being resurrected.
Yes.
And, you know, we might take a mature view and say, well, God is able to bring the atoms together of every human body at the resurrection.
Yeah.
But in Jewish religion, this is why those dead hostages or murder victims are so important.
And it might just interest you as well. It's also why in Jewish culture and tradition and Judaism, they don't allow an autopsy. They don't want the body defiled or corrupted. It is sacred in the image and likeness of God.
Okay, let's move on.
Yep.
A little bit to squeeze in here. What do you think? Will Donald Trump deal with Hamas breaking the ceasefire?
Well, you know, it's actually hard to know. When he was leading up to winning the November election of 2024, he actually warned Hamas and said, if you don't have them all released by the time I get to the White House, all hell will break loose. They didn't release them all, and all hell didn't break loose. President Trump made the claim in the Middle East just recently at the signing of their ceasefire agreement that he believed Hamas really wanted a lasting peace. And now I say this with the greatest respect. I think that's a naive point of view because he doesn't understand the driving ideology that Hamas holds to, okay? Hamas has broken the ceasefire, as we've already said numerous times, and he was actually asked, the president was, he was asked in a I think it might have actually been when he was speaking with, having the signing with Anthony Albanese. I could be wrong on that, but he was asked about Hamas breaking the ceasefire, and he said, quote, because I read this in the Australian newspaper. This was from yesterday. He said, we made a deal with Hamas that they are going to be very good, they are going to behave, they're going to be nice, and if they're not, we're going to go and we're going to eradicate them. If we have to, we'll eradicate. They'll be eradicated, and they know that. They're a violent group. They got very rambunctious and did things that they shouldn't be doing. If they keep doing it, then we're going to straighten it out, and it'll happen very quickly and pretty violently. Now, the problem, as many people see it, is that having already made such a claim in previous years, in 2024, and not actually acting on it, there are people who think that Hamas is now emboldened and they're not frightened of any kind of consequence. So in this regard, I think we're just going to have to wait and see. Don't forget as well, President Trump has got some pretty significant trade deals with Qatar. And Qatar, for a tiny nation of only 2.8 million people, wields phenomenal power around the world because basically many nations have been bought and paid for with petrodollars. He doesn't want those to implode.
There seems to be a little bit of fear, given that Hamas is still in charge, although I know they're going through all sorts of, clan uprisings and all sorts of things, like an internal battle going on. But this concern that some have, if Hamas remains intact, that there's going to be support that's going to come eventually to rebuild it.
That's right. And you've got to take into consideration that at the moment, Qatar and Turkey, they're wanting to be the big gorillas in the block in Gaza. And the concern is that they're actually not interested in rebuilding Gaza, but rather to rebuild Hamas. Okay, they're huge supporters. Both of these nations have aided and abetted them. They have given them safe haven. Turkey has even given some of Hamas members Turkish citizenship. There is an organisation, the biggest base of Hamas is actually in Turkey, and it is actually worked and operated by terrorists that were released in 2011 in the exchange deal when Israel got their one soldier, Gilad Shalit, back. Over 1,000 terrorists were released on that day. Many of them are living in Turkey, heading up Hamas base over there. There's a great deal of concern about it, and a very good article that is actually at gatestoneinstitute.org that is actually about the concern about Qatar and Turkey being allowed to actually get a foothold in the Gaza Strip. If they did that, that will be devastating. It will be really bad, and it will certainly be bad for the Palestinians.
My suspicion, Mandy, is that those in Israel sitting around the war cabinet table, if that's what they call it, are not really just resting on their laurels right now, but they're probably still concerned that there's an uprising ready to happen at any moment. What do you understand?
Well, they know it, Neil. They know it because they've lived through this same scenario before. There's a ceasefire deal. Hamas breaks a ceasefire. The whole world tells Israel, don't you dare respond. And then they're back to where they started.
What have you been gleaning about how they might be seeing a future?
Israel, you mean? Well, here's the thing. When the very early months of the war, the nations of the world began withholding components that Israel needed to defend herself, military components, okay? And it's happened in every single conflict that Israel's ever been forced into. And initially, of course, the nations of the world say, Israel, they have a right to defend themselves. But the problem is, as soon as Israel begins to take ground and win, then all of a sudden they change their mind and say, you've gone too far, you have to stop. Oh, and now you're a war criminal. She hasn't done anything wrong. She's fighting to defend herself and free her people, but now she's war criminal. The problem with this time is that this war has lasted 2 years, whereas usually it's a matter of weeks or months. Okay? And so what's happened is these nations of the world have said, well, we're going to withhold our arms deals with you, and we're not going to sell you these components or weapons. And Israel then gets boycotted. Now, many nations of the world so far have cancelled their military deals with Israel, which, again, prevented her from getting these necessary components and weapons. When this began, I remember posting on social media that in the face of this opposition, I said Israel would probably pivot, adapt, and establish her own industries in order to provide her own military needs. Well, that's exactly what she's doing. At least 24 nations have restricted arms sales to Israel, and then Monday of this week, Prime Minister Netanyahu said this. This changes Israel's international situation, both in terms of our ability to import weapons, components and ammunition, and it threatens us with the seeds of economic sanctions. This is a fact. We will increasingly need to adapt to an economy with autarkic characteristics. An autarkic characteristic means that it's without foreign trade, okay? He said, this is a word I hate the most. I am a supporter of the free market, but we could find ourselves in a situation where our arms industries are blocked. We will need to develop arms industries here, not just research and development, but also the ability to produce what we need. He said, we are Athens and Sparta. Now, I had to do a little bit because I love history, and I said, what does that mean, Athens and Sparta? Yeah. What it actually means is that Athens was known primarily for its politics, its culture, the arts, creativity, philosophy, education. It was a direct democracy that its citizens participated in the running of the nation. Flip that with Sparta, which was an oligarchy of 2 kings and a council of elders, and their entire focus was on military might and an economy centred on agriculture and a land-based army. Well, Bibi Netanyahu was saying, we've got to be both. We've got to be a democracy that has that's thriving and runs on the will of the people, with arts, culture, startup technologies and all of that. We are also going to have to be a military might that is self-sufficient. So they've got to be both. I tell you what, Neil, if they do it, and they will be the envy of the world.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Mandy, for listeners, I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, not everybody loves the sentiments of a Mandy Worby when it comes around this. But Just let us in on some of the sources, because there might be some listeners who might say, well, I might go and check some of these sources where Mandy's getting her information from, because what I'm seeing in the mainstream media isn't giving me any of this sort of insight. Is there 2 or 3 you can mention?
Well, there's a couple of Israeli newspapers that I would recommend. They're not on the hard left. They're not on the hard right. They're very centrist. There's JerusalemPost.com and there's Vision National News. I'm not sure if it's .com or .org. I'm not sure. But J-Post, Jerusalem Post and Israel National News. There are 2 Christian news websites. One of them was established by Joel Rosenberg. It's called All Israel News. And the other one is Israel 365 News. Excellent articles there. For the clarifying of a lot of the errors and lies in other media, what's that one called?
Honest Reporting?
Honest Reporting.
That's the one. Yes,
Thank you, Neil.
Yes.
HonestReporting.com is another one. There are others. Once you start digging and finding, you'll find others. But honestly, when you find out the other side of the argument and not just what we're fed through mainstream media, which just comes from a very biased source. Don't forget, there's an awful lot of let's just say Middle Eastern petrodollars that are invested in secular media as well.
Mandy Worby, always insightful. Thank you so much for bringing us these thoughts once again today on 2020.
My pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.